Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient forest where every tree whispers a secret in a language just beyond comprehension. The wind carries fragments of meaning, stories of gods, of creation, of cosmic order. But the deeper truth remains shrouded, not in silence, but in symbols. For centuries, humanity has wandered this forest, interpreting the whispers as literal truths, building temples around echoes, and etching doctrines into stone from the shadows of metaphors. But what if the forest itself was never the point? What if the whispers were never meant to be taken at face value, but were instead signposts pointing towards something far more vast, far more alive? This is the heart of everything you've ever been told about God was a metaphor, until now. The revelation that the divine, as we've known it, was never a fixed entity to be worshipped, but a living, breathing mirror of human understanding, refracting through time and culture. The gods of old were not false, but they were not final. They were metaphors, brilliant, shimmering vessels for truths too immense to be spoken plainly. The thunder was not Zeus, but the roar of a universe speaking in elemental poetry. The burning bush was not Yahweh's voice alone, but the cosmos itself aflame with meaning. And now, in this moment of human evolution, the metaphors are dissolving, not because they were lies, but because we are finally learning to see beyond them. The curtain is lifting, not to reveal a solitary figure on a throne, but an infinite tapestry of interwoven consciousness, a dance of energy and awareness that has always been humming beneath the surface of every myth, every scripture, every prayer. This is not the death of God, but the birth of God as we were always meant to understand, not as a noun, but as a verb, not as a being, but as the very fabric of being itself. To step into this understanding is to unshackle the divine from the constraints of human language and to allow it to breathe anew. It is to recognize that every story ever told about heaven and hell, about sin and salvation, about judgment and grace, was a finger pointing at the moon, and we at last are learning to look beyond the finger. The journey ahead is not one of discarding the old truths, but of seeing them for what they always were, a magnificent, evolving dialogue between the human soul and the infinite. To grasp the essence of this shift in perception, we must first wander through the ruins of old understandings, tracing the outlines of what was once considered sacred and unshakable. Imagine standing before an ancient cathedral, its stained glass casting fractured light upon the stone floor. For centuries, people knelt beneath those windows, believing the light itself was holy, never realizing that the true sanctity lay not in the colored panes, but in the sun beyond them. This is the nature of metaphor, a vessel that carries meaning but is not the meaning itself. The gods of antiquity emerged from humanity's earliest attempts to make sense of an overwhelming cosmos. In the thunderstorm that destroyed homes and took lives, our ancestors perceived not impersonal atmospheric conditions, but the wrath of a sky deity. In the fertile soil that yielded abundant crops, they saw not geological processes, but the generosity of an earth goddess. These were not mere fairy tales or primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated symbolic systems attempting to articulate the ineffable patterns of existence. Consider the evolution of the divine across cultures, from the pantheons of Mesopotamia and Egypt to the philosophical monotheism of Greece, from the tribal deity of early Judaism to the universal father of Christianity, from the absolute oneness of Islam to the non-theistic awareness of Buddhism. Each tradition captured a facet of the ultimate. Each reflected the particular needs and insights of its culture, and each was limited by the conceptual vocabulary of its time. The divine, as it has been spoken of, was never a monolithic truth, but a mosaic of interpretations, each piece a reflection of the society that birthed it. To say these were mere inventions would be to miss the point entirely. They were translations, imperfect yet necessary, of a reality too vast to be contained in any single form. The mystics of every tradition have always known this. Meister Eckhart, the Christian theologian, spoke of the need to take leave of God for God's sake. The Upanishads proclaimed, Neti Neti, not this, not this, recognizing that any concept of the divine was necessarily incomplete. The Taoist sage Lao Tzu began his great work with a humbling admission. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. These voices were not denying the reality of the sacred, but pointing to its transcendence of all human categories. They were acknowledging that our symbols, while powerful and necessary, were always just the map, never the territory. And now, at this inflection point in human consciousness, we are beginning to set aside the maps, not in dismissal, but in readiness to explore the terrain directly. The second fundamental shift is moving from God as a noun to God as a verb. When we speak of divinity as a static entity, we freeze it in time, trapping it in the amber of dogma. But what if God is not a being to be worshipped, but an unfolding to be participated in? What if the sacred is not an object of devotion, but a process of becoming? The mystics of every tradition have hinted at this. The Sufi poets who spoke of the beloved not as a distant king, but as the breath within the breath. The Hindu sages who proclaim tattvam, thou art that, dissolving the boundary between seeker and sought. The Zen masters who insisted that Buddha nature was not something to attain, but to recognize as already present. This is the great unlearning, that the sacred is not above or beyond, but within and throughout, a current rather than a statue. Language itself has constrained our understanding. Indo-European languages, with their subject-verb-object structure, predispose us to see the world in terms of separate agents acting upon separate objects. God loves the world, immediately creates three distinct entities: God, love, and the world. But what if there's only the loving? What if God is not the doer of divine acts, but the doing itself? Indigenous languages often capture this more fluid reality. The Lakota phrase, midikui oizing, often translated as all my relations or we are all related, does not simply describe a connection between separate beings, but invokes a reality where separation itself is the illusion. The Hebrew name for God, often rendered as I am that I am, points not to a being among beings, but to being itself, the isness from which all things arise. This shift from noun to verb has profound implications. Prayer becomes not a petition to an external authority, but an alignment with the flow of the whole. Worship becomes not the adoration of an other, but the recognition of the sacred in all things. Ethics becomes not adherence to commandments, but participation in the harmonious unfolding of life. The divine is no longer something to be believed in, but something to be lived. Consider the difference between a musician playing from sheet music and one improvising from a heart. The first follows prescribed notes, seeking to reproduce exactly what is written. The second enters into the creative flow, becoming a conduit for something that moves through them, but is not separate from them. The first approach might produce technical perfection, but the second births something alive, something new. So too with our relationship to the sacred. The doctrines and dogmas were the sheet music, valuable guides, but never the music itself. The third transformative insight is the collapse of separation between the human and the divine. The old metaphors spoke of gods descending from the heavens or prophets ascending. Mountains, reinforcing the idea that divinity was something apart from us, something to be reached for. But the emerging understanding is that the separation was always an illusion, a trick of perception. Quantum physics has revealed a universe where separation at the fundamental level breaks down, where particles once in contact remain mysteriously connected across vast distances, where the act of observation changes what is observed. Ecology has shown us that the boundaries between organisms are more permeable than we once believed, with complex symbiotic relationships blurring the lines between individual and environment. Neuroscience has begun to question the rigid boundary between mind and world, revealing how our consciousness is not confined to our skulls, but extends into our bodies, our tools, our social networks. Each of these scientific domains is, in its way, pointing toward what spiritual traditions have long intuited, that separation is a useful fiction rather than an ultimate reality. The kingdom of heaven is not a place to enter, but a lens through which to see. When Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is within you," He was not offering a metaphor, but a key. The divine is not a distant father, but the very ground of being, the awareness behind your thoughts, the silence beneath your words. This understanding transforms every aspect of spiritual life. Sin is no longer transgression against an external lawgiver, but a forgetting of our true nature. Redemption is not being saved by something outside ourselves, but remembering what we have always been. Grace is not a gift bestowed from above, but the natural expression of our interconnectedness. The divine is not something to connect with, but the connection itself. Consider the ocean and its waves. Each wave appears distinct, with its own shape, size, and movement. But no wave exists separate from the ocean. It is simply the ocean in motion. So too with consciousness. Each of us appears as a distinct self. A wave of awareness with unique thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. But no self exists separate from the ocean of consciousness. We are simply consciousness in motion, the infinite taking temporary form. This is not mere philosophical speculation, but a lived reality accessible through contemplative practice, in deep meditation, in the flow state of creative work, in moments of profound love or overwhelming beauty. The sense of separate selfhood can fall away, revealing a spaciousness that feels simultaneously intimately personal and vastly beyond the personal. This is what the mystics have pointed to as the direct experience of the divine, not as an encounter with an other, but as a recognition of what we have always been. The fourth theme is the evolutionary nature of spiritual truth. Just as science revises its models in the face of new evidence, so too must our understanding of the sacred evolve. The metaphors of the past were not wrong. There were steps on a staircase we are still climbing. The god of the Bronze Age was a warrior. The god of the Middle Ages was a judge. The god of the Enlightenment was a clockmaker. And now, we stand at the threshold of a God beyond all images, a presence that cannot be named because it is the namer, a force that cannot be depicted because it is the canvas itself. This evolutionary view challenges the fixed notion of revelation that has dominated many religious traditions. What if divine revelation was never meant to be a one-time download of ultimate truth, but an ongoing conversation responsive to humanity's growing capacity for understanding? What if the sacred texts were never meant to be the final word, but the first word in a dialogue that continues to unfold? There's an old tale, whispered in many forms across many lands, of a seeker who climbs a mountain to meet the divine. At the summit, after years of arduous journeying, they find not a radiant deity, but a mirror. In some versions, the mirror shatters. In others, it dissolves into light. But the message is always the same. What you sought was never outside you. This is the power of symbolic narratives. They do not explain truth so much as unravel it within us. Consider the story of the Tower of Babel, often interpreted as a warning against human hubris. But what if it was never about punishment? What if it was about liberation? The collapse of a single language, a single understanding, forced humanity to scatter and diversify, not as a curse, but as a necessity. The unity we sought through uniformity was never true unity. It was conformity. The divine speaks in 1,000 tongues because reality itself is too vast for any one interpretation. The tower fell so that we could learn to listen beyond words. Or take the Hindu legend of Indra's net, a cosmic web where every jewel reflects every other jewel infinitely. This is not just a beautiful image. It is a map of consciousness. The metaphors of old were individual jewels, each reflecting a facet of the whole, but mistaking the reflection for the source. Now we are beginning to see the net itself. The divine is not any one jewel, but the radiant interplay between them, the boundless connectivity that sustains all things. Even the story of the fall in Eden takes on new light. The serpent was not a deceiver, but an illuminator, offering not damnation, but awakening. To eat of the tree of knowledge was to step out of childlike innocence into the messy, glorious responsibility of co-creation. The expulsion from Eden was not a punishment, but an initiation, the birth of the human journey toward realizing our own divinity. The metaphors were not lies. They were the wrapping paper around the gift of our own becoming. To grasp these ideas as abstract philosophy is one thing. To live them is another. How does one walk through the world once the metaphors have fallen away? The first step is to release the need for certainty. The old gods offered absolutes, clear commandments defined, heavens and hells. But the divine as verb does not deal in fixed answers. It thrives in questions in the fertile unknown. This does not mean abandoning morality or purpose. It means rooting them not in external authority, but in deep, embodied wisdom. Imagine a musician who has spent years rigidly following sheet music, afraid to stray from the notes. One day, they realize the music is not the notes, but the space between them, not the score, but the aliveness of the sound. They begin to improvise, to play from a place beyond rules. This is the shift from metaphor to direct experience. Prayer becomes not a recitation, but a listening. Meditation is not an escape from the world, but a plunge into its depths. Service is not a duty, but an overflow of connection. In relationships, this understanding dissolves the illusion of separation. If the divine is not a distant judge, but the very substance of our being, then every interaction becomes sacred. The cashier, the stranger, the enemy, each is a flicker of the same infinite awareness. This does not mean tolerating harm or bypassing justice, but it does mean recognizing that no one is outside the circle of the sacred. Consider how this might transform our approach to environmental crisis. If nature is not a resource to be exploited or even a creation to be stewarded, but the very body of the divine, then ecological destruction becomes not just unsustainable, but sacrilegious. Our relationship with the earth shifts from management to communion, from use to participation. Or consider the implications for social justice. If the divine is not parceled out unequally, but fully present in each being, then systems of oppression are not just unfair. They are a fundamental misreading of reality. To recognize the sacred in all is to be compelled toward a world where all can flourish, where the dignity inherent in each is honored in our social arrangements. Even in the face of suffering, the metaphors shift. The old question, why would God allow this, assumes a divine puppeteer. But if God is the unfolding itself, the question transforms. It is no longer about allowance, but about participation. The divine is not causing the storm, but is the solidarity within it, the love that refuses to let go, the resilience that emerges from brokenness. Our task is not to beg for intervention, but to become the hands of the sacred, the eyes of the awakened. This view does not solve the problem of suffering, but it reframes it. Pain remains real, loss remains devastating, but they are no longer punishments from above or meaningless accidents in an indifferent universe. They are part of the texture of a reality that includes both light and shadow, both creation and dissolution. Our response is not to escape suffering, but to meet it with the fullness of our presence, to let it break us open rather than shut us down. It would be a mistake to see this emerging understanding as entirely new. The mystics of every tradition have glimpsed aspects of this reality, though they often clothe their insights in the language of their time. The indigenous wisdom traditions have preserved more holistic ways of relating to the sacred, though they were often dismissed as primitive by colonial powers. The poets and artists have sung of this, though their voices were often drowned out by the theologians and the dogmatists. What is new is not the truth itself, but our collective capacity to receive it. Humanity stands at an inflection point. We have developed the cognitive tools to deconstruct our old metaphors while simultaneously reaching the limits of what those metaphors can sustain. The planetary crises we face, ecological, social, spiritual, cannot be adequately addressed through the lens of the divine as a separate authority. They require a shift to the divine as the ground of our being, as the interconnected web of which we are a part. This shift is not about rejecting our spiritual heritage, but about receiving its deepest gift. It is about hearing not just the words of the tradition, but the silence between the words, not just the doctrines, but the living experience they sought to express. It is about moving from the menu to the meal, from the map to the territory. The poetry, Eliot wrote, "We shall not cease from exploration, And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. This is the journey we are on, a return to an immediacy with the sacred that was perhaps known to our earliest ancestors, but now enriched by the journey through metaphor, through concept, through the necessary disciplines of differentiation. We began in the forest of whispers, where the old gods spoke in riddles. Now, we stand at the edge of a clearing where the light is no longer filtered through leaves. The metaphors were never the enemy. They were the bridges that carried us here. But a bridge is not a home. To cling to it once we've crossed is to miss the vastness that awaits. This is the transformational call, to step out of the cathedral of inherited ideas and into the open sky of direct knowing. Not to reject the past, but to honor it by moving beyond it. The child who once believed the moon was a silver coin grows up to marvel at the truth, not with disillusionment, but with deeper wonder. So too with the divine. The metaphors were beautiful, but the reality is breathtaking. You are not a servant of the sacred. You are its expression. Every moment, every breath is a note in the song that has no beginning and no end. The choice is not whether to believe, but whether to participate, fully, fiercely, freely. The old metaphors brought us this far. Now it is time to speak the unspeakable, to live the unlivable, to be what we were always meant to be. Not worshippers of the divine, but the divine itself waking up. And so the forest fades behind you. The sky is wide. The journey is just beginning.